So, what do you want to change in the current system within which you're working?
Okay, so I'm particularly working in child protection. So the question at the heart of what I'm trying to do is to ask, how do we reduce the number of children who are abused or neglected? How do we prevent that happening to children? And the starting point is the clarity that the status quo is not working. So we know that, for example, for every child on a child protection plan, there are 8 children who are being maltreated, for whom there is no protection. And we know that the system, the services provided by the state or the voluntary sector or the actions of citizens are heavily weighted towards picking up the pieces of the problem, like many social problems. And very little is invested proportionally in preventing it from happening in the first place. So to go to the heart of the problem requires 2 things. It requires to accept that everything is up for grabs because the status quo isn't working. And secondly, to put the problem and the focus of your problem at the centre. So in this case, the child. And to be prepared to bring the clarity of analysis, but also creativity and invention, ingenuity, from a wide range of perspectives, to think about how you would, given a blank sheet of paper, rethink the system being not only statutory services, but any player, including citizens, who could play a part in tackling this social problem. And where that takes you is to potentially rethink the way that the services are provided, what kind of services exist, the roles for the citizen, the state and others. It throws really everything up in the air in order to provide the fresh thinking and perspective that you would need to know how you would get from where you are now to where you need to be. And rather than starting with the status quo and the systems as they exist and trying to innovate from there, it tries to imagine they don't exist and rethink them, and eventually to bring you back to the reality of where you are now in order to adjust where you're going.
Okay, brilliant. And that brings me neatly on to my next question, which is around the future. And one of the things we're really interested in is whether people working on systems change have a clear vision of the future, and whether you think that's an important part of your work.
I feel very strongly that you do not need to know where you're heading. Mm-hmm. I mean, by that I mean you don't know the answer to your question before you start. You're very clear about the question, and you're very clear about your ultimate goal. So actually the goal of preventing child abuse and neglect isn't a given in a way that you might think it is, in that actually for many people there's a very fatalistic reaction to that. It'll always be with us, it's very difficult, and even if it's not explicitly said, a sort of feeling that it's motherhood and apple pie to expect to prevent child abuse and neglect. In my view, it's perfectly possible to change the way people behave and for societies to adapt. And so the starting point is a clarity about that goal and a certainty, almost in the absence of any clear evidence that is possible. But I absolutely believe that if you're shackled with having to answer the questions of what the system should look like before you've started, then you shut up all possibilities that you might need to consider, and that the creative process has to allow you to spend some time handling the difficulty of not knowing what the answer is, along with many different perspectives. That's the creative process. It's the willingness to go on that journey that matters. It's not the certainty of where you're going to end up.
Yeah. Okay. And do you find yourself in a position where other people agree with you, or is that need to find the answer something that you kind of have to deal with on a day-to-day basis in your job?
No, I think that's absolutely true. That the need to find the answer and the way that it can make most people feel very uncomfortable with the taking away all the certainties of what we have now, at least theoretically in your head, is a very real barrier to systems change and a very human reaction. And I'm not sure that everybody can play a part in that for that reason. That there is a need to at the end of the process, you need to be able to offer those who are very anxious about change, full stop, some concrete stepping stones towards systems change, because I think the fear of taking big leaps and the consequences of doing so is what holds back progress, and so you have to address that really straight head on.
Okay, so that touches a little bit on another really big question about your theory of change, and obviously there's a lot of that's implicit in some of the things you've already said, but I just wondered if you could set out your theory of change, your sense of what are the kind of, I hate this word, but levers, tools, the things you've got in your kit, if you like, and how do you plan to deploy it?
I don't think I'm entirely clear, actually. I think that I can see some levers and some processes that are helpful, but I would really hesitate to put it forward as a theory of change. So what are the levers that I'm thinking of? I suppose I think a starting point is very clear and very well communicated analysis. So a lot of problems such as these are hampered with an extraordinary amount of analysis and data and statistics and opinion, and all cutting through that with the clarity to define the problem has to be your starting point, because, and you have to ensure that you get people to at least start with understanding what the problem is. And really getting at the fundamental question. So when you look at child protection, for example, there are many, many aspects of challenge and problems and improvements that need to be made. And you could spend a lifetime trying to adjust what's there. So if you step back, the fundamental problem is that we don't know how to prevent abuse and neglect effectively. And for me, kind of the clarity of recognising the big problem that underlies all the little problems is really important. But being able to communicate that is really essential. I think other aspects, I think the creative process, as I've alluded to, is absolutely essential, and that means inviting into the conversation some of the most unexpected people, perspectives, voices, and never. The real failure of systems change is often that it's a very closed conversation amongst the same people who can't see a new perspective because they are reinforcing the perspective that they hold as a group. And so in some ways it's essential to constantly invite in from the outside the challenge of someone who will see it from a different point of view, if only to sort of readjust or test or rethink. And as soon as you stop doing that, you close down the possibilities of thinking about change. So I think that's absolutely key. Knowing learning from experience, as we have through decades and decades of public service reform, the failure of implementation, and the fact that too often the conversation is held amongst those delivering something to citizens, but the citizen isn't in the room, is, you know, a critical problem, and ensuring that going back to the perspective of the child and the context in which the child is living, and ensuring that that is constantly part of the dialogue, if you like, is critical. What other aspects?
I know you're doing lots of work on framing and changing norms. Is that part of? Do you see that as part of your systems change?
I do. So
agenda?
I think that the way we communicate about social issues generally can open up or shut down certain avenues. So in child protection, our style of communication is that we see abusers as weird people, unlike ourselves, who we other them. We imagine them to be very different from anyone we know, and we experience a sort of an emotional reaction to abuse, understandably, which means that we don't really want to indulge in any great thinking about the abuser's motivation or the cause of their own behaviour. And that inability to go beyond shock, horror, and an expression of disgust at somebody else's behaviour impedes real understanding about what is happening, really, and the context in which behaviour is taking place, and the factors that underlie human behaviour that are entirely within our gift to change. So currently the way we frame child abuse and neglect leads us to believe that it isn't possible to fix, that you just have to lock people away, whereas it is entirely a societal problem that is within our gift to change, and until we explain its manifestations and how it happens, it won't be possible to have the kind of the meaningful conversation we need to have. And I think that's a public conversation as much as one between professionals, because I think the kind of the wider conversation in society affects the way that we all respond, and that includes services.
Okay. Brilliant. Just a couple more questions really around this sort of theory of change stuff. Do you think, no, let me put this a different way, who are your allies and your enemies, if I sort of very emotive word?
Well, I think I come back to the fear question, because I think if an enemy is somebody who blocks system change, it's somebody who fears change and has feels that they have something to lose. And I think that's a very, very human response to shaking the tree or questioning the certainties that we have, particularly around an issue which is so difficult to handle individually and as a society. So actually most of the people who work in child protection are enemies in that, by that definition. But somehow to turn them into agents of change, you have to be honest and address their fears. And I don't think you do that in quite the way that I've described, in terms of, you know, exposing them to the analysis which shows everything they're doing is not going to solve the problem they intend to solve, or frightening them by tearing down, at least hypothetically, everything that they know and asking them to rethink it. I think it's the real challenge is to manage that process or achieve that process, but to take those people with you. And I guess that's often where the two worlds sort of stop. So there are individuals for whom there is less invested or there is less fear about imagining things to be different. And then there are individuals who have the power and the resource to bring about the change. And somehow those two groups have got to come together. And it's possible that you need sort of intermediaries that can work quietly on both sides, because without that, I think you end up frightening people into resisting change rather than going along with change.
It's really interesting, because one of the things we've been talking about is to what extent is systems change about power and changing the locus of that power. And from what you just said, you kind of situated the people who are comfortable with change as separate from the people who hold the power and the resources. And I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that. Is systems change really about changing that locus of power? Is that at its heart what we're doing, or is that not quite?
Well, I suppose I believe very strongly in a public sector ethos that means that actually, deep down, we fundamentally are working for the same things. So actually, I think you go into social work or you go into local government to try to transform the life of citizens. So I think there's something to work with there, because actually your goals are the same. You don't have to remove the power from those people in order to achieve the change. But what you do have to do is to recognise that that having invested so much in sustaining a system as it is, then it's a very big and courageous step to rethink it, and actually the sort of the psychological process that you go through for accepting that what you're doing only achieves so much, and you would have to be prepared to imagine something different. That's quite a big change. I'm not sure it's about power, other than making sure that the citizen has perhaps greater say over that for the reasons I've said about needing to put them very much at the centre.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the next thing I'd like to ask you about is whether, we were just talking about this, whether you can tell us about an example of really compelling systems change that you've seen, either at a very local or national level. Can you tell us a story about something you've seen illustrates it?
Well, I think if you cast the system as being the widest possible sense, so not just services but citizens and all the factors that bring to bear on our social problem, then I don't think I can recall many, if any, examples of that. I think, other than perhaps some of the examples that led to the services we currently have at the beginning of the process, when the creation of the welfare state and so on. So those were times when systems change happened, where there was a rebalancing of the role of the state and the citizen. There was, in the absence of very much else, the creation of new services. And we haven't seen those kind of changes since. Where there are examples of coming at a problem afresh, I think we've seen some very interesting examples of changes in approach. So, for example, reclaiming social work in Hackney has been and is often quoted as part of systems change, is a fresh way of organising the way that professionals work amongst themselves to address a social problem, putting the problem at the centre, thinking about the range of of skills and professionals who have a bearing on that problem, working far more collaboratively, moving away from instruction to professional judgment and dialogue, and living with the messiness of those decisions and difficulties of certainty in those circumstances. To great effect. I mean, as we've seen in Hackney, I think what strikes me though is that is within enormous constraints still. So the system around it has changed very little. So it's possible to carve out those sorts of changes where permissions are given, or flexibility is allowed, or budgets are pulled. But if you stand back and look at the grand scheme of things, most of what happens has continued as before. And I mean, systems change doesn't mean that everything has to change, but you have to question whether those sorts of innovations are anything more than a sort of the image that comes to mind is a sort of barnacle on a whale, something new. But the fundamental system has remained the same, almost something new in order to counter how the rest of the system's working. And so I think that is a real question. Is it possible to? Is that right? I mean, perhaps that is the way in which systems change builds. You start small, you show it works, you build people's confidence, you get over the fear, and you allow it to spread. And maybe it's the spreading and the growing that is critical, because the kind of wholesale revolution is way too dangerous, scary, difficult, and given people's fear. But it is slow, so it means that it would take you, several generations to get to your change, and I feel more impatient than that. Right. So I think that's a real challenge. Right. Okay. Whether that's and it feels like quite often it's the easier route. It's where you can find the levers to pull, or
but they're starting small. Yeah.
But perhaps that's not very courageous, and what's needed is something that's more courageous.
Okay. Last question on the kind of big picture stuff. Interested in your reflections on the role of organisations and institutions in system change. Can it happen from within organisations and institutions? Can it happen without them? What do you think?
That's a really good question. I think organisations are inherently conservative. So I think if it comes from within an organisation, it's often at the hands of an agitator, an individual, an exceptional individual. And that's often hard to replicate. So I think somewhere there has to be some grit in the system, and it's often easier to bring it in from outside. But in some ways it's better if it grows from within, because it's can be owned and perhaps spread more quickly. I think one of the challenges for systems change is that it's very difficult to find permission, space and time to do the work that's necessary to rethink, to challenge, and for many many work in child protection, for example, there is so much demand on their time to just to meet today's demands, that sort of stepping back and thinking about tomorrow's is very hard, and sometimes you need extra capacity to do that. You need someone to kick you off, or to offer you up something that's not right, but gives you something to work with. Or yes, I think it can be either, but probably easier if it comes from outside.
And thinking specifically about your work, would you answer that question differently? No.
I think the same. And I would include the organisation in which I work. I think that, the work that we've recently done thinking about how child protection dialogue is framed has been massively assisted by having an organisation outside of the sector, even outside the UK, reflect back to us what they see. And there's something about that process where it gives you permission to stop and look beyond your to-do list. So there's something important about it. And the key then is how to bring it in so that it isn't just a one-off agitation that doesn't go very well, but to think about how it's owned in the organisation and really becomes embedded in the culture.
Okay. So we've got probably about 20 minutes max left.
Okay.
It might not take that long. I want to flip and get a bit more personal now, if that's okay.
Of course.
Not too personal, but and just to get you to talk a little bit more about your relationship system change. So let's start with a sort of easy-ish question, which is how do you describe the work that you do to other people?
I describe it with great difficulty, actually. I mean, I think, in short, I would say I'm working on child protection challenges, entrenched problems, and trying to come up with solutions, basically, in short. I normally try to describe it by saying, rather than critiquing what's going on and providing a sort of running commentary on policy and practice, we're trying to take problems, challenges relating to child protection and do the kind of creative and analytical process that I described to put forward new solutions in a sort of proactive way.
And do people
get it?
Yeah.
No. No, they don't get it, I don't think.
And why is that, do you think?
I think, wow, that's a good question. Why is that? I think people find it easier to understand if you have. They judge your what you do by your role or your responsibility. So your role, you provide a service, you make something, it kind of fits into a fairly narrow number of categories of things that you could play in society. Or your responsibility, I'm responsible for this outcome. What we're doing is we're sort of moving between roles. Sometimes we're bringing people together. We're a sort of networker, facilitator. Sometimes we're challenging and holding up a mirror to society or to others. Sometimes we're experimenting. So we don't. Those things don't fit into the sort of normal understanding of what a job is, and it's perhaps quite difficult to also understand what it amounts to, and to measure its effectiveness.
Okay. This is a slightly random question, but if you were to pull out your diary from last week, what would we see? What kind of things are you spending your time doing? Not keeping you to account, but just on a day-to-day basis.
On a day-to-day basis. So, last week would be a good example in a way. So, part of the week was spent explaining social problems through the media. So some of what you're doing is trying to contribute or even reset the public discourse around an issue by offering up a way of describing what has happened. That's part of the week. Part of the week is working within my own organisation to with the team, but also with others, to do the kind of creative solution focused work. So debating an issue like how do we remove child abuse images from the net? That process might involve seeking advice from a wide range of players. It might involve thinking about where the pressure needs to bear in order to bring about change. Thinking through how you might put pressure on in a way that was going to be effective. It might be simply about really getting the analysis right and the facts straight. So some of the week would be we spent on that kind of activity. What else? Quite a lot of the time is spent on building relationships with others. So, systems change doesn't come from one organisation. It certainly doesn't come from one individual. It is about probably quite a relatively small group of people, but the right people being involved, and it requires a huge amount of trust and shared understanding, and it's a very long and complicated journey. So at each stage you have to invest quite a lot of time in just sustaining the relationship, and that might be around trying to solve a problem together, or sometimes it's about trying to articulate together what you want, and that may actually take quite a lot of time to put on a page or to develop your script in a way that you both feel comfortable with, and that's just bilateral, so there's many different relationships there. What else? So what it isn't, I suppose, is delivering a service or spending time directly witnessing or involved in child protection. So that's quite removed from. There's a lot of work involved in reading about it or looking at the analysis of it, but it's quite far removed from the real community, and that, in some ways, that's a very uncomfortable challenge, because I think increasingly I think it's actually important to ensure that you're not so far removed from the situation in which a child could be abused that you can't see what all the factors are.
Have you always wanted to change the systems within which you've worked?
Probably, but I don't think it's the system that I'm sighted on. So I think I've always wanted to play a part in achieving societal change, a social problem, and that's so actually how much of the system has to change is less of an issue. It's much more about what impact it has. But yes, I think from very early on, when I was studying psychology, my motivation was to understand how that could help you solve problems like, football hooliganism or aggressive, road rage, or it was trying to think about how you could play a part in making an improvement in society. That was the motivation. That is the motivation.
Okay. And do you feel hopeful or pessimistic?
I feel hopeful. I do. I don't think I don't think that. I think some of the problems that I've worked on will not be resolved in my lifetime. I know that, but I think I can see, the possibility of change, and I fundamentally believe that the sort of issues that I'm interested in are issues which is very much within the gift of society to change. And so I think if you lost that belief, then you would be very pessimistic. But I think a lot of the problems that we face are problems that society have created, and therefore they're problems that society can solve.
Okay. That's the end of my questions. Thank you. Just thinking, are there other things, that we could have talked about that you could have gone down a route of covering? So I think one of the questions I was going to ask was around strategies and tactics you've used, which you kind of talked through. So, I think it's good to keep that as a prompt, but actually I didn't feel...
No, we had some in there.
Good, yeah.
I think that's...
The power in the organisation stuff, I think I need to have a little think about how to get at that, because I think the other bit of the organisational question, which we're quite interested in, because on the personal question, we're trying to get a sense of kind of character and from the people we're interviewing, and one of the things I'm interested in is people's own personal relationships to organisations. So I wonder whether that's, obviously we talked a bit about the role of organisations from that sort of more macro perspective.
But if you ask me the question, do you feel you belong in an organisation, the answer would be definitely not.
No, okay.
And I've never belonged.
Right, okay. We're going to make sure we ask that then.
And that's maybe partly, it goes back to that fear issue in a way, because if you have a very strong attachment to a profession or an organisation, the threat of change is very deeply felt. Whereas if you don't actually feel, bizarrely almost feel, I feel very uncomfortable with being attached, which is maybe that's the key to it in a way, because it's not threatening to me to change it. And also, I think if you can kind of have a slightly outsider perspective on things, you can sometimes bring greater clarity than if you are so invested in it that you can't see the wood for the trees. So that's definitely a trait.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. So I think maybe we will make sure that makes it onto the list. And then the other thing I was conscious we didn't particularly talk about, maybe it's irrelevant, but the kind of role of government. And the role of money, and the way we organise money. And I just wonder whether that's would it have been helpful to get you talking about that?
Yeah, I have sort of two completely conflicting reactions to that, which is one is that it's very easy to blame government for lack of systems change. It's very easy to believe that the centre can bring it about, and that's really not true. It's both. It's the constraints are sometimes overplayed, and actually because of the things we talked about having to have outsiders sort of bringing in change is probably more likely to come from outside than it is the centre. You might have to have some facilitation, but so I think that's true. I think then my kind of conflicting reaction is also the extent to which there is this strong sense in whatever part of a system you are that you don't have the power to challenge and change it, that you have your target set or funding streams fixed, or your priorities determined by, if not determined by central government, certainly determined by the sort of what's in the public domain as a kind of key priority at that particular time. And those constraints feel very real to people, I think. So somehow, so yeah, I think it definitely has to be part of the picture and understanding how you get through that. But I'm not of the school where you say if only central government would allow more flexibility, and I think that we don't grab the power that we do have quite in the way we could. And it's sort of far too. It's easy to say, oh well, if I was given power, I'd do it, but I'm not. And I think that's something that we should challenge.
Who or what inspires you?
Oh God, I mean, I'm really inspired by individuals who free themselves from the constraints of others, so who don't feel beholden to others and are prepared to really take the sort of personal risk of confronting a social problem and trying to come up with a better way of addressing it. So, the kind of person who springs to mind is Camilla Batmangela, who has no sense of feeling that she is beholden to her funders, her government, her local authority. She has a very strong personal sense that she has a responsibility to try to make a difference, but without the sort of self-imposed constraints that many of us work under. And as a result, she's a very refreshing perspective on a problem. She brings a very refreshing perspective and a huge amount of drive and determination to make a difference. But those kind of characters exist in all walks of life. So it's it can be somebody running a food bank, or working through a church community, or it's people who've been prepared to stop and question and take the personal risk that comes with challenging the status quo. Those are people who really inspire me, and it's leadership of a different kind to what we traditionally call leadership. So the constraints of being in power mean that often those things get taken away from you, and that the real leadership comes from those who don't feel the pressure of having to be beholden to others.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay.
That's awesome.